Okay, good morning. Let's get started. I have a neuroscientifically inspired consciousness philosopher on my right-hand side. Again, neuroscientifically inspired Hegelian philosopher on the left side, and the neuroscientifically inspired historian on the other end. I am just a neurologist who has neuroscience, but nothing else in his repertoire. Thankfully, my only function today is just stay put and chair the session. My co-chair is here. Why don't you explain what we are going to do today?
Peki. Merhabalar. Ben aslında Türkiye'deki konferanslarda İngilizce konuşmaktan hoşlanmıyorum ama konuşmacılarımızın yüzüsü hürmetine İngilizceye döneceğim. Mazur görün lütfen. Welcome everybody. My co-chair says he's just a neurologist, but he's more of a philosopher than most philosophers I know, including myself. So he was just being modest. This is a symposium that tries to bring together something about the mind-body relation from three different perspectives, trying to provide a broad lookout on the question of mind, body, and the brain. Professor Dan Smale, a historian who is well versed in neuroscience, is going to talk about what we can know about what he calls the deep history of the brain. Catherine Malibu, who has written very influentially on the importance of neuroplasticity. We'll talk about neuroplasticity from a Hegelian dialectic perspective. And I will try to give a sense of what consciousness studies today are doing and what the state of the art is and how it evolved into the place it currently occupies. With that, I turn the microphone back to my co-chair.
Is that good now? Yeah, that's better. And to again, Guven for organizing this, and also to my colleagues Hakan and Catherine for their participation on this panel. As Guven mentioned, I've been quite interested in these very large questions about connecting history, including deep human history, with the cognitive sciences. For this paper, what I would like to do in a way is to give some of the more of the theoretical background for the remarks that I offered yesterday on compulsive hoarding. And in particular, I'll be working through some of the theoretical suppositions, working back to cognitive archaeology and some of the recent approaches that are emerging in paleoanthropology and archaeology, just surveying some of these issues to give you a sense of the enormous activity that's going on in this field right now. If there's time at the end, I'm going to come back to something that I'm very interested in as a research topic, which is shopping, but I'll keep my eye on my watch and try not to go over 30 minutes. Is that right? When the modern science of history emerged in Europe and the Americas and Turkey and other places over the second half of the 19th century, it took as its principal mission the need to explain the emergence of civilization and the origin of nations. And in the late 19th century, this is when nations themselves were emerging. It's when all the symbols of nationhood were emerging. The concept of the citizen was developing, things like the census, all kinds of technologies of visibility that created citizens and created national apparatuses were emerging then. And all this went hand in hand with the simultaneous emergence of universal state-sponsored education. And the practical outcome of that is that as history was emerging as a science, it was emerging as occupying a role in a curriculum of universal education. which more or less shaped history into one of its major service functions, which was to provide origin stories about the emergence of nations. And all of this was influenced by the theory of progress that was swirling around in the 19th century with figures like Spencer and Darwin. And that is what gave the story of history, the story of the climb up from infancy to adulthood in modernity. Along with that model of history came an understanding that the way in which we should approach the past is to look at the changing social and political and economic formations of the past. So in a Marxist model, for example, how you could have a feudal economy that would give way to a capitalist economy, and how there'd be changes in the matrix of society and power and culture, and it was history's job to describe that. But in this philosophy of ongoing change, few historians ever thought to ask themselves whether humanity itself was changing along the way. So in this paper, what I'm hoping to do is to lay out some of the theoretical grounds for a different approach, a new approach toward understanding changes, patterns of change in the human past, where the basic argument, the simple point, is that humanity itself is changing along with the social, political, economic, cultural structures. And in particular, what I mean is patterns of mind or cognition or feeling or emotion, all of the things that we take for granted when we think about what it means to be human. So what I'll begin by describing is what's emerging now is the post-genomic or the interactionist approach to understanding the phenotype, how brain, body, and mind are constantly engaging with the external environment and are where the two of them co-produce each other. And then I'm going to take a little detour to talk about how evolutionary biology and ecology and environmental history are thinking about the structure of change in complex dynamic systems. And in particular, I want to lay out this important concept of coevolution, which has a lot of homologies with what I think we're going to hear about dialectics. Actually, I'm quite eager to find out what Catherine thinks about the homologies between coevolution and dialectics. The point about this digression into this subject is the importance of discovering a motor of change, an explanation for why there is change in human history. And that the motor of that change, and again, I started to lay this out a bit yesterday in my remarks about compulsive hoarding, lies in the relationship between humanity and the material environment. So this is what's going to lead me to the title of my talk, The Cognitive Incorporation of Things, but I'll be covering other subjects as well. And again, to summarize this point, the idea here is that humans make things, maintain a built environment, manufacture objects, and in so doing we change our habitat or our niche, but in changing that niche, we change the patterns of cognition of the nature of the mind because the mind adapts to the niche that it's currently in. So the result of this is that there can be a vector for historical change, an understanding about historical change that emerges from this interaction between humanity and this constantly changing material niche. So let me begin by laying out what I'll just call the conventional understanding of the human past. So according to this conventional view, which certainly dominates in my field in history and in many other fields where people think about the human past, that humanity was shaped by biological evolution in the deep past, where biological evolution is understood to be a slow process where we gradually filled a particular niche. And this process produced what's called in the circles a biologically modern human a long time ago. And for historians, it doesn't matter when that happened. Among paleoanthropologists, they would set the date to around 190,000 years ago, or approximately 200,000 years ago. That's when an anatomically modern human came into being, an entity that's virtually indistinguishable morphologically, phenotypically from a modern human. And there's continuing debates about this, of course. So again, in the conventional view, there have been extraordinary changes since then, and I'll be describing some of the changes of the Paleolithic a little bit later, but with the agricultural transition 10,000 years ago, with the rise of cities 5,000 years ago, with the emergence of industrial civilization 200 years ago. And again, in the conventional view, all this has been cultural change. The basic idea here is that biological evolution gave way to cultural evolution. And I call this the handoff model from biology to culture. If you read the works of Stephen Jay Gould, the great paleontologist, for example, you will find this concept everywhere. Biology in the past, culture in the present. And on the other end of the spectrum, the famous American anthropologist Clifford Geertz also argued almost exactly the same thing in the second chapter of his interpretations of culture. So we could call this this conventional approach, at least I might call it the genomic point of view. And what I mean by that, it's based on an understanding that individual phenotypes are built by genes in some simple and uncomplicated way. And that in the past there was genetic change. And now that genetic change has been superseded by cultural change. And that, in effect, genetic change or biological change has been shut down in favor of cultural change. And the assumption is that the operations of culture shelter us or hide us from selection pressures offered by the environment. So a very simple example might be the fact that that we can adapt to bright, sunny environments not by changing the color of our skin, but instead by wearing sunscreen. And again, this would reduce the selection pressure on us because there's been some cultural barrier that shelters us. This understanding of history is also intrinsic to some fields of evolutionary psychology. And again, I mentioned this briefly yesterday, the idea that cognitive modules evolved in the past in the context of an environment of evolutionary adaptedness, and the idea that these modules persist more or less unchanged despite the massive changes in the matrix of human culture and society nowadays. And the basic idea here is that there's a mismatch between the modules that we inherited from the past and the matrix in which we live now. So according to this genomic or conventional view of humanity, the human past, the only thing that changes in the human past is the matrix of culture and society, economy, and politics, and that the individuals in that matrix are exactly the same as they were 200,000 years ago. So everything else changes, but the individual is unchanged because the genome hasn't changed. And again, it depends on this simple understanding that whatever the individual human is, it's an uncomplicated expression of the genome. Now, the last 2 decades have seen the rise of a perspective that offers a radical new critique of the conventional understanding of the human past. And this is actually coming out of your fields. It's coming out of the scientific fields, genomic fields, psychological studies, psychiatry. In this case, those of us in the social sciences are consumers of the things that are emerging in the world of medicine and biology. So this is what in a lot of the literature is called a post-genomic or an interactionist approach to the human phenotype. And I've seen the word relational. There's a number of different terms that are now being used to describe this new approach. So according to this approach, there's no simple or uncomplicated flow of information from the genotype to the phenotype. And instead, all facets of the human phenotype, morphological, physiological, psychological, and behavioral, emerge from the interactions between genes, development, and the environment. So an interactionist approach to understanding how the human phenotype emerges. There are innumerable examples of this in recent literature in fields such as epigenetics and developmental systems, and I'm sure many of you have your own examples. I'm just going to describe a few examples just to give some concrete case studies of this interactionist approach. And in particular, I'm going to be choosing examples that can help explain why these approaches are interesting to social sciences and to fields like mine history. So let me begin with a study that was done by a neuroscientist named Lee Gettler and his colleagues. This is a study of testosterone in males, and it was a survey of 624 men in the Philippines, covering somewhat longitudinal, covering a certain span of time. One of the first things that this study showed is that men who had high levels of waking testosterone were more likely to become fathers. So there was a definite correlation between levels of waking testosterone and fatherhood. But the remarkable thing, as they were following this through, is that those who became fathers often experienced significant declines in endogenous testosterone after fatherhood. And the decline primarily affected men who reported giving 3 or more hours of childcare per day. And I've seen other studies that have shown that skin-to-skin contact is one of the major effects here. But even being around children for a minimum of 3 hours a day causes testosterone to decline. Now, this is interesting for lots of reasons. Testosterone is one of those complicated hormones that it does a number of things in the body. Among men, it sometimes or perhaps even often leads to status conflicts that can express itself in violence and competition. It doesn't have to. It's not a simple cause and effect relationship. And again, I'm sure many of you know much more about this than I do. But even if there's no simple cause and effect between things like testosterone and dominance conflicts, there's no question that it does have consequences for that. So for historians and sociologists, there are some really important conclusions that we can draw from studies like this. And this comes from the fact that the desire and the ability to offer caregiving among fathers is not defined by the individual's genotype. It's also shaped by the ambient social and economic structures. So just by way of a thought experiment, you can imagine a society that not only allows maternal leave to have a child, but also requires paternal leave for a period of 6 months or a year. You could imagine the consequences of that in terms of the aggregate levels of endogenous testosterone among men in a society. You can see how this thought experiment, how the levels would be a consequence of, in this case, of governmental policies. And it wouldn't be just governmental. There's also social and economic structures. Just to take an obvious example, one of the great features of the apartheid regime in South Africa was forced labor migration, where men would have to leave homelands and go and work for long periods of time in mines and other places. And they would come back, father children, and leave again. And again, this type of economic structure, if Gettler's study is right, necessarily has consequences for the way in which these men, their testosterone levels and the way in which they experience themselves and their society. And closer to home, at least for me, is this extraordinary tragedy in my own country, which is the very high levels of imprisonment of African American males, which are extraordinarily high. And again, it removes them from caregiving. And again, if Gettler's study is right, this has long-term consequences, not only for the men, but also for their children. So since I mentioned imprisonment, let me move on to a second example involving the stress response system. I've been working a lot, trying to work a lot in stress lately. It's a very interesting field. There's a lot of these results are coming out of a lab, Michael Meany's lab up in Toronto. And let me describe one of his studies. The important thing about stress, just to preface this, is that there's a difference between the everyday stress that we might experience and chronic stress. So I want to draw a difference between everyday stress, which we face all the time, and chronic stress, which is a very debilitating condition. It's often associated with a loss of initiative, with obesity, with things like low infant birth weight. That's one of the products of chronic stress. There have been some very interesting studies of African American women in the United States which have shown that there's a persistent low infant birth weight that can only be traced back to conditions of chronic stress. So what the Meany lab did to study, as they were beginning to study stress, and this is following the pioneering work of Robert Sapolsky, they found ways to handicap a male mouse so that it would lose a series of fights with other male mice. And I'm not in this world, but so I was surprised to learn that male mice are constantly fighting for dominance and mating privileges. So they handicapped the mouse in a way so it lost a series of battles, of fights, and I think it was 5 or 7 or more. And what would happen then is that the mouse that was losing these battles would fall into a condition of chronic stress, and it was marked by permanently high levels of cortisol and other chemicals that you could actually measure. Given access to cocaine, this is one of the things that they were testing. They found out that the chronically stressed mouse would self-medicate itself with cocaine at a higher rate than other males. So they were actually pursuing a kind of a therapy. It's very interesting for our understanding of who uses drugs in our society. One of the remarkable things about chronic stress is that it can be inherited epigenetically. And again, this is from the Meany lab, that they've shown that when rat mothers lick their pups acquire more stress receptors in the brain. And if the rat pups are not licked, their ability to handle stress is significantly reduced. Female rats who were not cared for as pups are in turn less likely to lick their own offspring. And you can get this pattern of inherited stress that echo down through several generations. It's actually quite remarkable. Feminists have pointed out that studies like this tend to heap even more guilt upon working mothers. So it's important to note that it also works for father rats. And this, I've only seen one study like this, and I don't know whether it's conclusive, but I'll mention it anyway. They did the same experiment where they chronically stressed a male mouse and then had that mouse mate with a female. And they then measured the number of stress receptors in the infants, in the babies, and they showed that they had fewer stress receptors, even though it didn't come from the maternal side. It came entirely from the paternal side. Quite how that mechanism works is very, very unclear right now. It has to do with the preservation of methylation patterns, and this kind of thing gets beyond my ability to describe. This is all part of the emerging field of epigenetics, which is now being historicized in a field in medical schools, and maybe even here in Istanbul, that's in some schools is being called historical trauma studies. And these are studies that try to do longitudinal analyses of populations that have suffered stress in the past. And the most famous example, some of you will know, are the studies of the Dutch hunger winter, the effects of starvation among the Dutch people in the hunger winter of 1944, I believe. And the Swedish famine study is also in this vein. And the particular goal of these, what these show, is that there's been this inheritance of stressful conditions down family lines. So these examples describe the way in which the ambient environment shapes endocrinological responses or the stress response system. Recent theoretical moves also suggest that changes in the environment also influence the operations of mind. So fields such as embodied cognition, or even more significantly, the extended mind hypothesis of David Chalmers and Andy Clark. According to this hypothesis, that the mind itself, or consciousness, is not actually seated in the brain, and instead emerges from the interaction between the nervous system and body, and between the nervous system and the ambient environment. And in the studies that I've seen, one of the examples that they come up with constantly are memory functions, such as the ability to outsource memory functions onto cell phones or other devices, or even notes and things like that. So the thrust of this literature is to challenge or break down the traditional Cartesian mind-body distinction. So these are all elements, I've just sketched this very briefly, these are all elements of this post-genomic or interactionist approach. And this has important implications for understanding who we are now. For example, it has policy implications for imprisonment, for things like the stop and frisk strategy policies that we used to find in New York City. There's even been talk of reparations for populations who have suffered stress in the past. But it also has implications for our understanding of history. So let me turn now to the past. The argument is quite simple. If the mind is a product of the interaction between the brain and the environment, the thing we call the mind itself is changeable, and that cognition should vary with the material and social environment. But because the material and social environment itself is constantly changing over the long span of human history, then we should expect to find, theoretically, that patterns of cognition themselves are constantly changing. So again, we get this constant feedback loop between the human phenotype on the one hand and the social and material environment on the other. So the basis for this approach lies in this co-evolutionary relationship that I described just at the outset. It's taken for granted in biology circles that organisms often co-evolve or evolve in tandem one with another. So example would include ants that inhabit acacia trees, where morphologically and behaviorally they co-adapt to one another. Gut flora in animals is another classic example of coevolution. Humans and horses are innumerable examples. There's virtually no organism that does not co-evolve in some respect. Some of these relationships, like the ones I just gave, are mutualistic, where both parties are getting benefits. But they can also be antagonistic. And this emerged in a very important study in 1973 by a biologist named Leigh Van Veland. It was called the Red Queen hypothesis. When it was reworked by Richard Dawkins and J.R. Krebs in 1979, they gave it another metaphor named the evolutionary arms race. And the classic example of the evolutionary arms race, and Kathleen, this is what we were discussing briefly last night, is how the cheetah and the gazelle, a predator and a prey, constantly, because the cheetah preys upon the gazelle needs to get faster to escape predation, but the cheetah needs also to become faster to catch the gazelle. And therefore, what has emerged from this relationship are two animals of the African savanna that are wildly faster than anything else out there. And it's just a very unusual tight bond between those two that has caused them to go spiraling off in this different direction. And that's what Van Veelen called the Red Queen hypothesis. Two organisms that dance madly, but relative to one another, never actually get anywhere. So these relationships can arrive at apparently stable plateaus. It's not clear that the cheetah or the gazelle can get any faster right now. But some of them have an inner dynamism that drives them forward, on and on. And so like the human and the horse, for a long, long time has had a dynamism, and now there's a different dynamism involving machines that's taken over where the horses are. These have vectors that keep moving in some way. Where humanity and materiality is concerned, the most important thing about co-evolution is that it does not have to involve two living organisms. And there's lots and lots of examples of this, where anthropogenic global warming is probably the most important. But this is where fields in environmental history are exploring the relationship between, say, diking and damming of rivers and the changes in the water table and the enormous effects that has on farming and things like that. There's lots and lots of studies that are done that talk about the relationship between humans and a non-living partner in the relationship. So let us now bring this back to humanity's deep past and to the material and social environment of the deep past. Once upon a time, the major thesis in paleoanthropology about how and why humans evolved was the climate forcing hypothesis, namely that there were shifts in climate that created an environment that pushed humans out of the forest and into a savanna, and that was the sort of the thing that pushed humanity onto this new evolutionary pathway. In recent years, two new approaches, very different approaches to understanding the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness have emerged. And the key element of this is the fact that the human niche, as we now understand it, always was and is a social and material niche. The social niche was and is defined by the imperatives of navigating a complex moral world of cooperation, exchange, and punishment. And the material niche obviously consists of tools and weapons and hearths and a growing array of other forms of materiality. In the case of both society and materiality, the niche we ourselves created constituted the most important selection force on the evolution of the human brain and body. So I'm not going to talk anymore about the social niche. I just want to focus here on the material niche. This emerged in the work of the paleoanthropologist André Leroy-Gourron, who first set out this argument that tools were the things that pushed us on the path towards cognition and the exteriorization of techniques. And there's lots and lots of examples about how our bodies morphologically incorporated things into them. For example, I'll just give you a quick example because I realize time's running a bit short. A quick example is that once weapons and tools become available in human societies, the things on the male phenotype that are designed to advertise threats, such as brow ridges, begin to recede because weapons can serve that signaling function much, much better. So there's this very interesting dynamic where the presence of tools and weapons are shaping the human phenotype. In addition to this was this trend towards the cognitive incorporation of materiality, namely the way in which objects work their way
Dan,
into
you're
mind.
almost done. Do you need extra time?
Yeah, I have a couple of minutes left.
Okay, good.
Is that okay? Yes. And the idea here, there's some brain imaging studies that have shown how, for example, how when monkeys use rakes, the image, the brain image, actually extends the hand out to include the rake as part of the apparatus of the body. So again, this is one of the many examples where the modern imaging sciences have been used to project or use as proxy evidence for things that are going on in the past. So since I'm running out of time here, what I would have gone through at this point would be a discussion of some of the trends that over the deeper span of human history about the way in which things are being incorporated into the human body. A lot of this, the point of this is to explain the gap between when humans emerged as anatomically modern about 200,000 years ago and the creative explosion 50,000 years ago, because the great emergence just in the last 10 years or so is this understanding of this stepwise development of materiality. And I could explain more if people are interested in that in the question and answer. So let me just conclude by commenting on what the consequences of this are for history. For me, the really important thing, there's two things. It's first of all, just to summarize the point that I've been trying to make, is that this incorporation of things both into body and cognition provides this motor, this engine for constant historical change. It explains why human societies have constantly been moving, rather than an internal, a purely internalist perspective. And then as far as history goes, in particular, it's for me, and a lot of other people, the dramatic thing is how this approach to understanding materiality and the human past can make us put together histories that cross the whole span of the human past from the evolution of hominins 1.7 million years ago to the present. And the effect of this is to transcend the national histories or the narrow national histories, the things we learned in school, the understanding of where we came from as citizens, to create a history that allows us to be an understanding of all of ourselves as a people. Thank you.
Okay, we'll have the discussion after all three talks. So why don't we proceed with you, Kasım?
Okay, so good morning. I'm also very pleased to be here, and thank you again to the organizers for inviting me. Thank you also, Daniel, for this wonderful talk. I'm sorry I had to change the topic of my presentation, so it won't exactly be on dialectics and neuroplasticity, but I will come back to your presentation in the conclusion of this paper, which has links with what you said. So my title has changed, and it is now From Sorrow to Indifference. I have focused these last years on emotional brain, and in this presentation I would like to explore an aspect of the possible political and social implications of the current neurobiological research on that point. To what extent does the research on emotions, the current research on emotions, both bring to light and explore new modalities of affects, as well as new determinations of power? This question will lead me to explore a specific affect. I will take the example here of the affect of wonder, which is not exactly admiration, but more astonishment and surprise. We'll see the role that this affect plays in classical theory of passion. And my question will be, are we experiencing today a loss of wonder? Is that what the neurobiologists, is that the conclusion to which neurobiologists come today? And what are the consequences of the impairment of emotions, of traumatic disaffection, and of the loss of wonder on our political conscience and on the feeling of ourselves? In order to articulate these questions, I will analyze a small philosophical problem, which is in Spinoza, and which is what he calls the passage from joyful passions to sorrowful passions. This will be the first point of my talk. And then, what is the difference between what Spinoza calls sorrow or sad passions to indifference? In one of his 1978 lectures on Spinoza, devoted to Ethics, Book 3, which is concerning the origin and nature of emotions, the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze writes, "When I pass from the idea of Pierre to the idea of Paul, I say that my power of acting is increased. When I pass from the idea of Paul to the idea of Pierre, I say that my power of acting is diminished." Which comes down to saying that when I see Pierre, I'm affected with sadness or sorrow. When I see Paul, on the contrary, I'm affected with joy. And on this melodic line of continuous variation constituted by the affect, Spinoza will assign two poles, joy and sadness. Sadness will be any passion whatsoever which involves a diminution of my power of acting, and joy will be any passion involving an increase in my power of acting. This conception will allow Spinoza to become aware, for example, of a quite fundamental moral and political problem, which will be his way of posing the political problem to himself. How does it happen that people who have power in whatever domain need to affect us in a sad way. Inspiring sad passions is necessary for the exercise of power. End of quote. It is a long quote, but in this quote, as you see, Deleuze reminds us of the two poles of emotions for Spinoza, joy and sorrow. Joy increases my power of acting, sorrow diminishes it, and political power has some interest in fostering in me sad passions. Inspiring sad passions is necessary for the exercise of power, so we will try to understand why, but I propose to modify this statement and transform it into inspiring indifference is currently necessary for the exercise of power, which, as I intend to demonstrate, appears to be more faithful to the current state of power in our globalized political situation. What I call indifference, and which is a constant motive in neurobiological research on emotions today, indifference is precisely not to be understood as a version of sorrow or sadness. It is not a form of depression or a form of dismay. It is not even a mood. It doesn't share any common features with boredom, psychic exhaustion, or despondency. No, indifference, as it appears, for example, in Alzheimer's disease, indifference must be taken here as indifference to indifference. It is not an affect, but results, on the contrary, from the loss of all affect. It is literally a disaffection, which appears as a loss of the capacity to wonder. For Spinoza, sadness and joy are rooted in wonder, that is, in our capacity to be astonished by the world, to be surprised by something, by the world or by the others. Indifference, on the contrary, impairs the very capacity to feel wonder. A sorrowful passion may always be reverted. It is susceptible to change. It may always be transformed into a joyful one. And Spinoza precisely teaches us to transform our sorrowful passions into joyful ones. Indifference to indifference, on the contrary, understood as the destruction of any possibility to wonder, is on the contrary not reversible. It has no opposite. It is not a diminishing of our power of acting, but proceeds from the destruction of the capacity to be emotionally moved. A situation which Antonio Damasio names, after the American writer Truman Capote, the possibility of acting in cold blood. The substantive wonder is the English translation of the Latin admiratio, as it is manifest in Descartes' Treatise of Passions and in Spinoza's Ethics, as I said. And again, admiratio in Latin is not to be understood as admiration, but again as the capacity to be surprised. Admiratio comes from mirare in Latin, which means to be astonished. And according to the dictionary, wonder, as a noun, characterizes first a feeling of surprise caused by something beautiful, unexpected, or unfamiliar. For the philosophers like Spinoza and Descartes, but for many more, wonder is what attunes the subject both to the world and to itself. It is an affective opening, which at the same time marks the origin of affects. For Spinoza, wonder is the first of all passions. And joy and sorrow comes from wonder. And in that sense, it has no opposite, he says, which means that you can be more or less open, you can be more or less joyful or sad, but wonder per se cannot disappear. It can be lessened, it can be momentarily absent, but it is indestructible. Current neurobiological research on the emotional brain contradicts this conclusion. Wonder does have an opposite, which is indifference. And again, indifference, as I defined it, would be the end of wonder, the impairment of wonder. It would not be a kind of affect, but the disappearance of all affects, coming from the possibility of being cut off, severed from one's own emotions, and consequently also from oneself. We know that after certain very severe brain damage, such a disaffection appears. And I took the example of Alzheimer's disease, but Damasio shows that this disaffection happened after most of frontal lobe lesions. Damasio shows that the study of cerebral diseases involving disconnections in the brain's emotional sites reveals a situation which virtually at the same time touches each of us, because we are all virtually, possibly indifferent. One of Damasio's most interesting points concerns the similarity between brain and social traumas. And here again we find the interaction between the biological and the social. Homeless, severely depressed people, serial killers, people suffering from PTSD, victims of rapes, abuse, and we might evoke many others, often present the same type of behavior, cool, unconcerned, what Damasio and Oliver Sacks also call absent without leave. Even if the lesions are not the same, biological and social, even if there are sometimes no lesions proper at all, these individuals manifest the same disaffection. So my question is, what does that mean? Are we really experiencing the end of wonder? For example, when Damasio plays cards with some of his patients, trying to engage them into something, they say they manifest a total indifference to the fact of winning. Damasio says, if you play that card, you will win the money which is on the table. They just answer that they don't care. So, to what extent can we consider that this indifference to indifference is the mode of being which political power tries to induce today? You remember Deleuze saying that political power has interest in fostering sad passions, and today I think that the interest is to foster this indifference. And what is, again, the difference between indifference and sorrow? Damasio, as you know, has a book on Spinoza, because he's very much interested in the way in which Spinoza describes affects and emotions. The book is called Looking for Spinoza, Joy, Sorrow, and the Feeling Brain, which is from 2003. In this book, he presents Spinoza, I quote, as a proto-neurobiologist. And he makes use of the geographical lexicon of maps and mapping to describe the neural emotional economy. Affects, Spinoza, well, according to Damasio, Spinoza says he anticipates on the fact that affects are neural map designers. Because of his conception of the body and the mind as being two different attributes of the same substance, Spinoza allows us to define affect as bodily manifestations of mental processes. These manifestations coincide precisely with what is called today the neural maps, that is, material surfaces which design the points of encounter between the body and the mind. An emotion, fundamentally, is what puts in relation the body and the mind, and also the body and the mind and the environment. So, what part do sad passions play in this economy? What are sad passions for Spinoza? Hate, I quote, hate, aversion, mockery, fear, despair, etc. They represent the lowest points of our power and alienate us. But Damasio goes farther than that and says that in some cases, as I said myself, these sad passions, these neural maps can be destroyed and sometimes without any possibility to be cured. So, in sorrowful passions, again, there's always remains the possibility of transforming sorrow into joy, rather than when the neural maps in themselves are impaired, there's no possibility to go back. I quote Damasio, the mind arises from or in a brain situated within a body proper with which it interacts. That due to the mediation of the brain. The mind is grounded in the body proper. The mind arises from or in biological tissue, nerve cells, that share the same characteristics that define other living tissues in the body proper. It is this interaction between the body and the mind which appears as the emotional region of the individual. But again, a gash, a cut in neural networks can cause a loss of this coincidence between the mind and the body and cause a loss of affects. The subject then is not diminished in its power of acting. It is cut off its own power from its own power of acting. Again, this does not produce sorrow but indifference. And when the originary unity between the biological and the symbolic is impaired or destroyed, the subject is unable to confer meaning to anything. That is why it is incapable of making a decision, of wanting to win the game, etc., etc. When the biological is impaired, the symbolic is equally damaged. An example that Damasio takes in Descartes' Era, his other book, he talks about Eliot, who is a living patient who has damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. His intelligence seems intact. He passes all the tests used to assess neurological damage, and he appears quite normal, except for an unusual calm in the face of his misfortune. However, he's completely incapable of making wise decisions. In business and his personal life, he handles affairs disastrously. Obviously, pure reason, which is quite present in Eliot, is not sufficient for decision-making because the emotions have disappeared. Deprived of affect, the subject cannot act. His or her power of acting is impaired. The subject doesn't make any decision because he or she doesn't care, doesn't see the value of acting, of choosing, of preferring, or of judging. Damasio says we might summarize Eliot's predicament as to know but not to feel. And he has other expressions like lack of concern, neutrality, absence of emotions, blank facial expression, etc. The possibility for the emotional brain to be destroyed and then separated from the cognitive networks is present in in individual. The virtuality of this fracture, this secret crack up between reason and affects, determines, according to me, the contemporary psyche. The neural subject, which emerges in the 21st century, is a potentially disaffected individual, a potentially non-affected subject, deprived of their capacity to wonder. As I said to start with, inspiring indifference has become necessary for the exercise of power. It is not so much a matter of diminishing the subject's power of acting, rather than making her unconcerned by this very power itself in creating constant shocks or blows or traumas which increase every day a little bit more our emotional coldness. Absence of empathy, indifference to politics. We would all potentially be similar to the characters of the Beckett's plays I was talking about yesterday. We are becoming indifferent to our political situation if sorrow implies a kind of diminishing of the power of acting, which renders the individual more flexible, more obedient. Indifference means that we don't care, which is also that we're totally indifferent to the dialectics Daniel was talking about. We're renouncing our own power of acting, and we are becoming indifferent to the fact that, in fact, our history is our own, and we just disappear from, we just let the interaction between the social and the biological happen without us. We don't want to play a role in that interaction. This effacement, this disappearance of our subjectivity from the political realm constitutes, according to me, the new face of the social. bearing witness to an emergent, globalized psychic pathology that is identical in all cases and contexts. In every case, indifference, emotional detachment, and profound passivity figure among the symptoms attached to the state of post-traumatic stress. Affective bareness is the trait that all these states have in common: loss of curiosity, loss of motivation, disinterest in close friends and relatives, withdrawn behavior, and all the behaviors of our children playing with their iPads, etc., cutting themselves from the world is a part of that also. So I don't say that we are all becoming indifferent, but that indifference, lack of attention, lack of wonder, lack of curiosity is the political weapon which is used today to cut ourselves from our own history and responsibility. Neuropathology today then is reopening in a new way the great question of the relation between biology and the social. The objective neurological impact of trauma makes it possible to sketch a new worldwide typology of psychic illness that, pertaining neither to neurosis or psychosis, allows the disaffected faces of the victims to appear as the border between nature and community. As we look at these disaffected faces, it is impossible to forget what unites them and effaces the distinction between lesional trauma, socio-political trauma, and trauma caused by natural cataclysms. The differences among the sources of such wounds tend, in fact, to become blurred on the level of their effects, phenomena of emotional bareness and withdrawal. In another book called The Feeling of What Happens, Damasio meditates on the figure of an old man walking through the streets of Stockholm. I quote from Damasio. From a window, he watches, quote, a frail old man make his way toward a ferry that is about to depart. Time is short, but his gait is slow. His steps break at the ankle from arthritic pain. His hair is white. His coat is worn. His whole body seemingly saying, is this it? Am I in the right place? Where to next? The vision of this lost old man immediately awakens a memory, Damasio goes on. 30 years ago, a man sat across from me in a strange, entirely circular, grey-painted examining room. The afternoon sun was shining on us through skylights as we talked quietly. Suddenly, the man stopped in mid-sentence, and his face lost animation. His mouth froze, still open, and his eyes became vacuously fixed on some point on the wall behind me. For a few seconds, he remained motionless. I spoke his name, but there was no reply. I got up and called him again. He stopped. He looked at me, and some expression returned to his face. He looked perplexed. I called him again, and he said, "What?" For a brief period, which seemed like ages, this man suffered from an impairment of consciousness and a form of deep indifference. Neurologically speaking, he had an absence seizure, followed by an absence automatism, two among the many manifestations of epilepsy, a condition caused by brain dysfunction. End of quote. How can we not be struck by the obvious similarity between the general behavior of a social outcast and a person with a brain lesion? How can we avoid drawing a connection between neuropathological disaffection and social disaffiliation? And I come now to my conclusion. Traumatized subjects, disconnected from their affects, present symptoms analogous to those that accompany brain disorders, even though they are not related to any lesions. It now appears that the impact of social war is just forceful as a brain lesion. Even if such blows do not always occur as sudden events, but tend to be more continuous or harassing, their sense, like that of the brain lesion, remains dissimulated between an absence of sense, between that indifference. We then have very often social conflict without any dialectic, as anonymous as a natural catastrophe, an absence that reveals the very coldness of the political and the social today. And I think that this is our responsibility to recreate a kind of wandering subject in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kasım. Yeah. Okay, Güven Güzeldere is our third speaker.
As an undergraduate, I studied computer engineering because I was interested in artificial intelligence. At the time, computers were making quite a lot of progress in, for example, playing chess, reasoning and planning, and doing things better than human beings, actually, in certain areas that involve logic and thinking and reasoning processes. But I was also interested in what it would take for a computer to experience sensations, to smell smells, to hear sounds, to maybe enjoy music or a sip of a good wine or a coup or something like that, or for them to feel excited, to fall in love. These questions were not in the literature in artificial intelligence. I thought maybe studying something that is in between philosophy and psychology and neuroscience could lead the way towards understanding these questions that I was interested in. So in graduate school, I decided to study cognitive science, which happens in the 1990s. But something very curious happened in the 1990s as well. Between the time I started graduate school and the time I ended, the whole world turned upside down vis-a-vis the question of phenomenal consciousness. Now, in philosophy, in cognitive neuroscience, in cognitive psychology, today, phenomenal consciousness appears to be the biggest problem. It's maybe the one word that appears most in new book titles, and there are numerous symposia that are arranged on phenomenal consciousness. But the subject matter of phenomenal consciousness has a very curious history. And when I studied this history, I saw that this interesting explosion of there being nothing on phenomenal consciousness in the early 1990s, and then everything being about phenomenal consciousness at the end of the 1990s, had actually happened in a reverse kind of way, once again, back at the turn of the century. Go to the library, pick a psychology textbook that was written prior to 1910, for example, 1890, 1905, something like that. Look at the index. You'll see that the subject matter of the psychology textbook is consciousness, is conscious states. And the main method is introspection. Then pick another book that was printed after 1920, 1925, 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s. You will not find the word consciousness even in the index or introspection. So the main method and the main subject matter of psychology, this is a very curious case in the history of science, goes from being everything about psychology to being nothing. There are, I think, certain reasons why there are these fluctuations that happen in the history of psychological and, to some extent, neuroscientific sciences vis-a-vis the question of phenomenal consciousness in a way that it really hasn't happened about any other subject. I'm not going to try to give a detailed analysis of that, but I find that a very interesting and curious history. I will, however, try to review the current state of the art vis-a-vis our thinking as philosophers, psychologists, neuroscientists about phenomenal consciousness, where we are, and try to give an evaluation of what the future might bring. So when I was starting graduate school, and there weren't really many books or articles or any symposia ever done on consciousness, I thought, well, one place maybe to begin could be a dictionary. There are professional dictionaries written for, as you know, psychiatrists, neuroscientists, psychologists. So one dictionary I picked up is the International Dictionary of Psychology that gives definitions of terms for psychology professionals. Under consciousness, it said the following. Consciousness, the having of perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, awareness. But then it continued. The term is impossible to define, except in terms that are unintelligible without a grasp of what consciousness means. Consciousness is a fascinating but elusive phenomenon. It is impossible to specify what it is, what it does, or why it evolved. Nothing worth reading has been written about it. So this is not a very encouraging beginning, but this is where things were in the beginning of 1990s. At the same time, despite or contrary to this odd absence of consciousness as a scientific subject matter in psychology, analytic philosophy, neuroscience, up to the beginning of the 1990s, every once in a while in the popular press you see some mention of consciousness as a mystery. So every once in a while, the Discovery magazine, the Time magazine, Scientific American, they would put a cover, it says the mystery of consciousness, the last unresolved mystery, something of the sort. Then when I started going into the literature, I decided to look at how people use the term consciousness, those who do use it in the history of psychology, for example. And there, too, a curious thing emerged. George Stout, one of the most important psychologists in the 19th century, he has a manual of psychology. And there he says, what is consciousness? Properly speaking, definition is impossible. Everybody knows what consciousness is because everybody is conscious. Freud says something similar in his lectures on psychoanalysis. He says, what is meant by consciousness we need not discuss. It's beyond all doubt. Much later, Francis Crick and Christoph Koch say something like that. We all have a rough idea of what it means to be conscious, and therefore we don't need to define it. So some people are saying we all know what's the bother. Others are saying nothing worth has been written about it, and so forth. This was the state of things as I was starting graduate school. Now, in this framework, here's how I would like to proceed in the rest of this talk. I would like to say a few things about these definitional issues, and then come back to the history of science and the fascinating case study of phenomenal consciousness in early psychology, and then try to look at how philosophers nowadays formulate the question of consciousness. Phenomenal consciousness nowadays is formulated, again, as a mystery in most analytic philosophy. And in fact, the mind-body problem, the one that was formulated by René Descartes back 400 years ago, is now divided into two mind-body problems. One easily solvable, that has to do with everything other than consciousness, and the second mind-body problem, that is hopeless, because it is centered around consciousness. So in some ways, we seem to be back where we started, but we in fact aren't. There are reasons to be optimistic if we just ignore some of these Cartesian pessimistic philosophers. So that's how I'll conclude. So if we try to give a definition of consciousness, we actually see that there are a few different ways we can approach the topic. There's a very operational definition that people in the medical field use, consciousness as a state of being alert and awake. If somebody passes out, loses consciousness, there's a certain procedure to check, and then they regain consciousness when they reawaken and so forth. There doesn't seem to be any mystery about that, even though there are interesting challenges. there has been, as I'm sure you know better than I do, this controversy of the phenomenon of waking up within general anesthesia when the patient doesn't have any way of communicating the fact that his or her consciousness came back during surgery, reporting this afterwards. Whether this is a confabulation or whether there's a way to measure these things, there's been a lot of interesting research on it. Nonetheless, consciousness as a state of being alert and awake is not what carries the brunt of this mystery charge. Nor does perhaps the third definition, consciousness as awareness of oneself as self-consciousness. This is a very conceptually loaded form of consciousness, self-consciousness, because it involves the recognition of oneself in relation to others. Perhaps self-consciousness, in the sense, is one feature of consciousness that is specific to human beings. But the difficulty there is not about the phenomenal side of things, but rather about knowledge and understanding and conceptual sophistication. The second one, consciousness as sensory or affective experience, awareness of sensory objects with qualitative features. This is where phenomenal consciousness actually comes to the surface. In order to proceed, let me say a few things about where the word phenomenal comes from, what exactly it means in this literature. Ancient Greek philosophers wrote about phenomenon, things appearing to view. And phenomenal inherited this sense of being visibly observable, perceptible by the senses, presented in appearances. 15th century onwards, in the Age of Enlightenment and throughout modernity, we see an important separation of human decentralized world of primary qualities as the object of objective scientific investigation that's available to reasoning and thought, on the one hand, and the mind-dependent conceptualization of the subjective world that is furnished with secondary qualities that happen to be available to sensory perception as opposed to thought and reasoning. If we follow that, we see that phenomenal properties or phenomenal consciousness has to do with the mind-dependent conceptualization of the world, with secondary qualities. There is a common philosophical puzzle that we hear in the popular press. If a tree falls in the forest but nobody's there, does that make a noise? Certainly, if a tree falls in the forest and there are no perceiving agents in the area, certain physical things happen that would have given the experience of a sound were there to be a person to perceive it. But the sensation of the sound doesn't exist. In this case, it's the sensation that is the secondary quality, and perhaps the airwaves that the falling of the tree waves, the tree makes, is the primary quality. From Galileo onwards, including Descartes, Boyle, Locke, most of the philosophers of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries did conceptualize the world in this sense, and their idea was that if you took away the perceiving agents from the world, you end up with a world that has no colors, that has no smells, that has no sounds, that has no happiness or sadness or joy or anything like that. But we have the same physical basis. You preserve the same primary qualities, but subtract away the secondary qualities. This is important because it's the business of science and objective study to study the primary qualities, the world as is, without colors, but with things that would have given rise to colors when there are perceiving agents in the world. So in that sense, science limits its study to the features, to the objective primary features, and leaves out very carefully all the subjective features. Now, this is an issue that will come out this afternoon in Hakan Gürvit's talk, because sciences, especially like a science like neuroscience or cognitive psychology, is in the business of understanding the human being, not just as a biological organism, but also as a psychological entity and as a subject. It is a great challenge, perhaps a paradox, to try to understand the human being as a subject while subtracting all subjective features out of the subject matter of your area. What can be done about it? Perhaps a reconceptualization of neuroscience in a way that has a broader perspective, and I think that's the kind of thing that Hakan will suggest. In this sense, the visibly observable, perceptible by the senses is what is referred by phenomenal, and it involves secondary qualities. Now, this division between the subjective and the objective in terms of the primary versus secondary qualities leads to a lot of interesting philosophical thought. I just want to mention here that Kant's important distinction between the noumenal and the phenomenal roughly corresponds in the sense of in the sense that phenomenal has something to do with what can be perceived and understood in that way by human beings. And Husserl, too, I think, in conceptualizing phenomenology as a systematic study of the structure of appearances, follows the gist of what phenomenal means in this very sense. So these are the definitional issues by way of an introduction. Now let me say something about how one particular attempt to bring in the subjective in terms of secondary qualities into the realm of science failed in a very interesting way about 100, 150 years ago. When we look at the history of psychology, pre-1850s or so, it's mostly people who call themselves philosophers who are interested in psychological questions too, especially empiricist philosophers like Locke and Hume. It was towards the end of the 19th century that psychology starts to exert itself as an autonomous discipline with its own methods, its own associations, its own journals, and so forth. And the first attempt of psychology to give a exhaustive understanding of the mind starts with understanding the secondary qualities. It's the school of introspectionism, which gives way to behaviorism within a few years, and I'll come to that in just a second. Cognitive psychology follows after that, and these days it's cognitive neuropsychology with the addition of new brain imaging techniques and the perhaps bringing together neuroscience and psychology in a particular kind of way. Now, there's, of course, a lot more to psychology. There is Gestalt psychology, there is psychoanalytic theory, and so forth. I'm not ignoring those. I'm just following a certain mainstream in the history. The first attempt of psychologists was to do psychophysics. Psychophysics is basically trying to build bridges between the objectively measurable energies in the external world and the subjective perception of them, the impact that they make in the human psyche, in the human mind. I think it's a fascinating study. Psychophysics has had a lot going for it. But the way it's evolved into the methods of introspectionist school of psychology ended up meaning disaster. So for roughly 35, 40, 45 years, the introspectionist school of psychology tried to understand, tried to answer questions like, how many discernible sensations could a human being have? Now, it's an interesting question. Ask that yourself. So a particular shade of red, another particular shade of red, another particular shade of red, and then you can move in the color wheel to purple and blue and so forth. Many. And then you can imagine sounds and smells. Given that our sensory systems are limited by certain information processing constraints, we are not open to perceiving all the energies in the world. The dogs can hear sounds that we can't hear. Bats can make use of sounds in perceiving objects in the dark that we can't do, and so forth. But given our sensory apparatus, how many different sensations do you think one can have? And add to these sensations perhaps feelings, affect, being excited or joyous or happy or sad, being tickled. The introspectionist psychologists thought was the question to pursue. And they started studying it in a very systematic, exhaustive, meticulous kind of manner. William James, in my opinion, the most important psychologist, at least in North America of all time, went to Germany, visited these labs, and concluded that it was only Germans who could take on a project like this because it required enormous discipline, enormous systematicity, and the ability to pursue things despite the fact that they were extremely boring. Now, two main laboratories, Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory in Leipzig and Edwin Titchener's, who was a student of Wundt, who moved to the United States and had his laboratory in Cornell, after many years of study, ended up with two very different results. Wundt's laboratory concluded that there were 10,823 humanly discernible sensations in the whole catalog. Titchener's laboratory concluded that it was in the 45,000 range, more than 4 times, and they couldn't give an exact number. The Germans in Wundt's laboratory accused the Cornell laboratory of being liberal Americans, counting too many things and sensations when they were not to be counted as sensations, and also being loose with their method. Titchener's laboratory had some unkind things to say about Wundt's laboratory too, but this issue remained an unsolved problem. It remained an unsolved problem because it became a problem about the central method that was used, the method of introspection. When you ask a subject whether they can discern these two particular sensations, do you just take what they say at face value? Do you give them training? Are they perhaps making a different judgment, not based on their sensations, but based on their expectations? All these issues contaminated, I think, this data. Another interesting debate was whether there could be imageless thought. This, too, you can ask yourself. Could you think about a triangle, for example, without thinking about a particular triangle? Could there be an abstract thought of something that is not accompanied by its image? These two laboratories had opposing results, empirical results, data, because they had their subjects who were saying, yes, I can actually have thoughts of triangles without thinking of any particular triangles, and the other laboratory subjects were saying, no, every time I think of a triangle, I think of either this triangle or that triangle or the other one. In this state of disagreement that didn't seem to be resolvable in any particular way, given the method that these psychologists were using, a very interesting person in the name of John Watson came out and wrote a manifesto in which he said, among other things, I'll just read the middle part, that psychology should turn from introspectionism to behaviorism because behaviorism claims that consciousness is neither a definite nor a usable concept. The behaviorist, who has been trained always as an experimentalist, holds that belief in the existence of consciousness goes back to the ancient days of superstition and magic. He was very influential. Within 10 years, nobody ever wanted to say anything about consciousness. They were all there, but they acted as if they were not working on consciousness. It's quite amazing. All the textbook